Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today is part 2 of what's ruining your bird photography. If you haven't seen part 1, don't worry about it. I'll leave it down below. You don't have to watch them in any order. But thank you guys for the feedback on the first one. It seems like it really helped a lot of you, and hopefully it's still helping you to this day. I had to spruce up the place a little bit because I just finished my field season, and when I came back, our city's going into code red or zone red or whatever they're calling it, and everybody's going to go back into lockdown. So it's, oh god, it's just horrible. It's so bad. Would I be the worst person in the world if I just booked a flight to Costa Rica for like 3 months and just stayed there? But with that, I hope you're all doing well and you're all safe. And let's get into the video with the first thing that might be ruining your bird photography, and that's noise. And when we first start photography, even the more you do it, everybody always says if you want to get lower noise in your image, you want to use a lower ISO. And although yes, that's a factor of it, I think there's 2 things you can do that are even more important than just lowering your ISO. If we follow that information of lowering our ISO, what it also does is it lowers our shutter speed at the same time, and then we're using the wrong settings to capture the birds we want to capture just because we're reluctant to push our ISO a little bit higher. So instead of just lowering our ISO, one thing that I really like to do is look for brighter backgrounds. I'll show you a few examples now of high ISOs with different backgrounds just to show you the effect it gives depending on how bright your background is. Now, I'm not saying don't photograph against darker backgrounds. There's many situations where it works to photograph against a darker background, but simply from a noise perspective, if that's of concern to you, try to find these bright backgrounds. And I don't mean pointing your lens towards the sun because it's the brightest source of light, but I mean just sometimes a subtle change can make a huge difference. Like if you have a tree with foliage behind your subject that's out of focus, maybe try to shift yourself so that you're pointing the lens towards the part of the tree that's in the sun versus the one that's in the shade. And that's a big enough difference, you know, it's just a different shade of green, but it's enough to make a difference and show less noise. And especially nowadays with great noise reduction softwares, it's not as much of an issue to push those higher ISOs, and you're better to push those higher ISOs and use a higher shutter speed, especially when there's action going on, than just trying to use the lowest ISO possible. The second thing we can do to help with noise in our images, depending on your camera, is to properly expose your photo in the first place. This is tip number 2 and 1, they're kind of like merged together, but tip number 2 is don't underexpose your images. Kind of like the tip about bright and dark backgrounds, there are scenarios when you want to underexpose your image. For example, if you're photographing silhouetted birds against a sunrise or sunset, you want to underexpose those images to retain the details and colors in the sky. But for the most part, you kind of want to try to avoid underexposing your images in all scenarios. The reason for this is even if you're using a low ISO, but you're severely underexposing your images, when you go to bring up that exposure in post, you might be introducing even more noise, even more than if you were just using a higher ISO. And it also might start messing with your colors, which is obviously something you want to avoid. So how do you get a properly exposed image, and what should you be looking for? Well, back when I was using DSLRs, a common term was exposed to the right. What that means is when you're looking at your exposure histogram, you have your shadows and blacks on one side, and you have your highlights and whites on another. What you're trying to do is increase your exposure and push as much information towards the right without clipping your highlights. When information begins to hit that right side of the histogram, that's when you start clipping your highlights, meaning you've lost all that information and you can't recover it, even when you go to edit the photo and you bring down your exposure. The benefit to exposing to the right is that you're starting with a brighter image without any blown highlights, and if underexposing your image and increasing the exposure leads to more noise and worse colors, well then overexposing the image without clipping your highlights and then reducing the exposure in post will lead to an image with less noise, better colors, depending on your camera. Since switching to mirrorless cameras, I don't use the term exposed to the right anymore. In fact, I don't even use my histogram anymore. I use something that I find more intuitive. The feature is called zebras. With zebras enabled, the zebra pattern will appear when your highlights are close to clipping or have already clipped depending on your settings. So instead of checking my histogram, I can now increase my exposure until I see zebras beginning to pop up. And once I do, I just lower my exposure until the zebras disappear. So this assures me that I've properly exposed to the right and I can safely recover any bright highlights in the photo while editing. If I'm not mistaken, this is also available on Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras, but for those of you that have those cameras, maybe comment down below if you have this feature. But to enable zebras on your Sony camera, go to the second tab in your menu, page 7, and click Zebra Setting. turn zebra display on, hit enter, and then go down and click zebra level. Under zebra level, you'll find a bunch of different numbers ranging from 70 to 109 if you actually click on the custom setting and switch your lower limit to 109. I used to keep my zebra setting on 100 plus, but a while back I switched to 105 since I watched a great video by Ryan Mentz where he explained the zebra settings in further detail. So I'll link that down below if you guys want more information on this setting. The third thing that might be ruining your bird photography is using too wide or too small of a focus area. And I get questions a lot about focus areas and which ones are the best. And pretty much all focus areas will range from these wide areas to these single dots. And I could look at this 100 different ways and overcomplicate it, but how I decide my autofocus area is pretty straightforward. The simpler the scene, the wider my autofocus area. The busier the scene, the smaller my autofocus area. Let me give an example. If I'm photographing warblers or sparrows, two groups of birds that are usually in thick foliage or dense brush, I'm usually using flexible spot small because I want to put that autofocus point right on the bird and I don't want it picking up on anything else in that scene. If I was using a wide autofocus area in that same scene, I'm essentially telling the camera that anything within this box is fair game. And I'm pretty much setting myself up for failure because a lot of times these birds are in dense brush and there's going to be leaves and branches and twigs moving around. So to simplify this even further, I realized I can ditch almost all of these autofocus areas. I only need one large autofocus area for simple scenes and birds in flight. And I also only need one small autofocus area for busy scenes with a lot of elements that can confuse the autofocus. The two autofocus areas that I use the most are zone autofocus, and that's my larger one. And then for my smaller one, I use flexible spot small. And I use those about 90% of the time. The other 10% of the time is actually manual focus because there's some scenes where the camera just can't get it right. And in those instances, instead of changing autofocus areas constantly, sometimes it's just quicker to put the camera into manual focus, manually focus exactly where you want it, especially with focus peaking and focus magnification on. It helps so much to manually focus on your subject. So narrow down your autofocus areas, use the ones that you think are most valuable to you, and the more you use them, the more you'll realize in which scenes they work best and when you should switch out to another one. So just keep practicing, try to narrow it down as much as you can, because I think on most cameras there's about like 8 to 10 options, maybe even more. The next thing that might be ruining your bird photography is not setting targets. Going out for general shooting is great, especially if you're in a new area, if you're new to bird photography and you just want to start building up your portfolio, or if, for example, it's migration and there could be anything around. Those are great times to go out for just general birding and general bird photography. But when you get into those times of the year, especially like winter, when there's not really much moving through, I think those are great times to set targets. Learn about feeding behavior, distribution, habitat, all that good stuff will keep you more focused in the field, because when you try to photograph everything, usually you end up photographing nothing. And I learned this the hard way when I went to Central America for the first time. Every time I would go out in the field, I would bring 4 lenses. I would bring a wide angle lens, a macro lens, a short telephoto zoom, and a long telephoto zoom. And when you go out and you have 100 different things on your mind and you're trying to photograph pretty much everything, those were usually my worst days in the field photo-wise. I still had a great time, obviously, but photo-wise, I didn't really come up with much. Versus if I just spent, 3 hours going specifically for macro and I want to do insects, and then spending 3 hours going specifically for birds. When you target your mind, you usually get better results. Putting all your energy and going after one species or going after one behavior is going to not only improve your photography, but it's also going to improve your ability to find wildlife in the field. I'm not saying general outings are bad. As somebody who likes to travel a lot, I'm usually in new areas with species I've never seen before. So I love going out, just seeing what I can find, not really targeting anything and just getting as many photos as possible. But what I've realized over the years is, every so often it is nice to create those targets and it is nice to go after certain species or behaviors. I might do a separate video on this, how I target species, what are the resources that I use, what my techniques are. If this interests you, write a comment down below just so I know that people are actually interested in this topic, and I'll make that video soon. And with that, I hope this provided some helpful tips to improve your bird photography. I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe. Hope you're doing well. Happy birding.